Okay, I've got a couple more ideas that might help um, in kind of understanding all of this, especially like things you might see in the Buffout log and references, pointers, stuff like that. Um, but I thought since since I kind of love philosophy, it's a big part of my life. I thought I'd share something that I also share with the people I work with. A lot of times they will ask a question, but most of the time, what they're asking isn't really the question they're asking. It's a way of expressing a question, but not really what they're asking. So I usually tell them that um, people are the embodiment of people, being everyone. It's kind of like a school of fish. Um, Sometimes they're fascinated by light that might reflect off the sides of other fish, and they have a tendency to school together, to group together. And people have a tendency to do that by sharing. I'm going to call it like light. They're so used to looking at each other's light, so to speak, that they never stop and look behind them to see where they're at. So imagine a body of people traveling through the universe and time, um, and never stopping to look behind them or beside them or out from them because they're so used to looking at each other, they don't really wonder, where am I? Where are we? Where are we going? Where did we come from? Um, and I think that's inherent to maybe sometimes that void, that kind of dark void, I think, that almost exists in the back of everyone's mind that they're kind of afraid of, so they kind of look to others, I think. And but it's oftentimes a good idea, and it's safer in a crowd, with like schooling fish. But oftentimes, I think people need to stop and look out from the school, out from the crowd to see, where am I? Where am I at? So thought I'd share that with you. Okay, so let's move on to some stuff I didn't get to cover the first time around. Looking back at this Buffout log, what I wanted you to look at, or maybe point out for everyone to see, is where it says navmesh asterisk. Okay, so in computers, you can have an absolute value. So let's say if you look to a memory location, there is a value at that particular address, that memory location address. And let's say that address, that value is, just, let's say 10, just has the value of 10. That 10 could represent the number of items. It could represent anything. But if that is a reference, if that memory location holds a reference, then 10 is the memory location to where the data starts. So you would think, like, let's say this is a memory location here, right? Let's say this is a register, but let's say this is a register. I'm assuming this is register stack pointer, and this is an offset into the stack block or stack data. So let's say this is a memory location. Okay, in this location is a value, and that value in and of itself points to something else. So let's say you load um, a texture in memory, and that texture sits at memory location 10. Now, it'll never be that low because that's more than likely operating system reserved. But just to say, just as a hypothetical, it loads it in memory address 10. Um, in this particular memory location, you have to load the value that is here and then use that as a pointer to the data. And that's oftentimes what it means when you see an asterisk by something. It's a reference or a pointer to a reference. And you can have, that's where you have like direct memory addressing, indirect memory addressing. You have things like that in assembler. But we won't even talk about anything like that. But that's usually what that means. So this tells me this was a reference. This is a reference or a pointer to a reference, and that's what made me think, okay, this is a bad reference or bad pointer. Now the question is, why is it bad? Um, my guess would be, again, somehow there's something in the nav mesh data that when it loaded that data from that plugin, the game code wasn't able to build the nav mesh properly, or something happened with the data and it couldn't build it at all. Because when you go back to the stack and you can see that, again, just to kind of quickly go over this again, you can see where the program, the kernel launches the program calls something else. We're building obstacle data. So again, that is a reference pointer. So obstacle data, to me, if I go by the name, basically says I have this 2D grid that says I can walk in this. Imagine a big square. It's a 2D square, XY points. I can walk anywhere in this square, but I'm going to put a box in the middle of that 2D square. So one technique would be to zero out the ones. So let's say every pixel is either on or off, right? It's one bit. It's either on or it's off. If it's on and I go to move to that part of that 2D grid, if there's a 1 there, I can move there. If there's a 0 there, I cannot. So that way you can easily start with a nav mesh, and then you could build a dynamic nav mesh by stamping down all the objects you can no longer you can't walk through. They're solid objects. So it gives the illusion, when you see that on the screen, you see this NPC walking, it comes across this rock or this box or this car or something you drop or another NPC standing there. It's like, well, I can't walk through that. Now that's not object collision, as you would see NPC and NPC, just as an example, but mostly with static objects like a box, a car, mailboxes, things like that. Um, it's there, and so you can't walk through it. So as you're moving about the environment, you're like, wow, it's so cool. It knows there's an object there. It can, but that takes more processing power and more CPU cycles calculating object collision than it does using a nav mesh, and that's why they use it for NPCs, because you got a lot of NPCs. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is about collision detection. Bethesda tried to improve frame rates, and I'm not saying this is inherent to Bethesda. This is probably a lot of game studios. They try to increase frame rates by reducing how many calculations they have to perform to see whether, let's say, you fire a bullet or something, you fire a weapon, and you want to know if that bullet is going to go through an object. That's why a lot of times, like as an example, you'll see, oh, I can clearly see that NPC, but when I go to shoot it, the bullet is hitting something in front of me, but there's nothing in front of me. That is because it uses a collision mesh. And a collision mesh is a very, very simple geometric shape. Usually it's a square or it's very simple. So imagine you have a person standing upright and their arms are at their side. You have the rounded shape of their body, the contours of their body. But a collision mesh doesn't look at that. A collision mesh says, I'm going to fit this person into a rectangle. Okay, therefore their shoulders are wider than their head, right? So if I'm shooting just, let's say I'm going to shoot just past their head, it falls within that collision mesh, because it's like, okay, the collision mesh goes out as far as their shoulder, so I'm not going to let the bullet pass. And therefore, it looks like the bullet is stopping on an invisible wall in midair just by their head. That's why you can't shoot through boards and through some types of objects. Now you can get around this by looking and say, okay, what type of object is this? Let's say it's a grating or it's a wrought iron fence. So I know the object that it hit is a wrought iron fence, or the object based on the collision mesh. So I'm going to look at the object's base ID, and I'm going to say, oh, it's a wrought iron fence. So I'm going to randomly calculate the odds of that bullet passing through, and I can completely bypass past collision a more detailed collision checking altogether. I don't have to look at the mesh. I know what the object is. I know it's a wrought iron fence. I know there's like little slots in it, where the bars go. So I can easily calculate, if I was going to do it, I would say, okay, what are the odds of this passing through? And I can bypass with one simple random number, a base call, which is a reference. I can look up some data, which is quick, and one simple random number to say whether that bullet can pass through. But other meshes are a little bit more complicated. So I believe, if I read a long time ago, what Bethesda does, and I'm sure other game studios do this, what they do is, once the basic collision box detects a collision, it then looks at the actual mesh. And I don't think that doesn't work for things like boards, like where you have a wall made out of boards and you can clearly see through the crack, but you can't shoot through it. Which technically you could. Now, another way to do that is to look at the texture data and say, okay, I've hit the board. Can I very quickly determine, is there a colored pixel here? Well, that probably wouldn't work because you'd see the colored pixel through the crack. So you might have to do it by depth buffer. Whatever the object position is in a depth buffer, you could probably then look at that object and say, okay, is there anything in any color showing in a texture, and allow that bullet to pass through. But that's the basic problem with that. So it looks like, by reading this name here, that it was actually collecting or generating obstacle data. And you can see that it's building a nav mesh. See build thread. So dynamic nav mesh. That's the dynamic nav mesh I was talking about. So it took the basic nav mesh, took the obstacle data, and now it's building a dynamic nav mesh for the game. And that's what you see here. Now, I'm not sure what the form type is for 76 for Fallout 4, but that's not Fallout 76. It's just a numerical ID that's given to a form. That's the actual form there. That's what, and this may not, like I say, when you try this may not even be an object. It may be an actual change form or something, but it was worth a try, to see if anything would come up. Okay, so each time it calls, here's collision filter, some kind of, and I think BHK is behavioral animations or something. Um, so it looks like it's trying to do this. I'm assuming, if this is a behavior animation, HKB animation maybe, it's trying to detect collision for, let's say, but I don't see pathing yet. So I'm not really sure what this does. Like I say, I'm just going by just looking at it from the outside in, and I honestly have no idea what this stuff does, but I'm looking at it as how I think it would make sense based on, the little that I know about certain things, like programming, things like that. But um, and then what I think it would be based on that. So you can see NavMesh comes up. So it looks like it was doing something with NavMesh. So it makes the next call, which then makes the next call, the next call, the next call. And it just keeps going up and up and up, and then we get a crash. So that is why I believe, that's why I think that's a pointer, or it contains a reference to a pointer in a memory location, and that's this, because that's bad. Either it was 0, and I should be able to look at one of these registers and tell, but I'm not that advanced yet to actually look at this. So, and I'm trying to look at it as I go. So I'm not really sure which register one of these would be. Yeah, so I'm not sure on that. I don't want to tell you wrong. But that's why I think it's this, because it was a pointer to something. It's bad, it doesn't exist. Um, and this is not inventing the wheel using a Microsoft DLL. And then unhandled. I had a thought about this, actually. I think breakfast must have helped, because I had a thought about this, and I thought about Windows uses a messaging system, and oftentimes message goes in a queue, and everything is based on messaging. It's COM message. It's how the operating system communicates to programs without allowing direct access to what the operating system has access to. It's kind of like a security thing. But if the operating system puts a COM message in that says this is an exception I detected, it waits until it processes that queue. So it sends it all through the application. Then the operating system says, did the application do something with that COM message? And if the answer is yes, then it trapped that COM message. and it removes it from that COM queue for that application. If it did not, then it wasn't handled, and we're going to stop the application at an unhandled exception. That was one of the concepts that came to me as I was having breakfast. So I'm not sure if that's really the actual case or if that's just breakfast talking. I'm not really sure. So, but I thought I would pass that on just as kind of something to build ideas on, and see if it makes sense. Okay, so I'm gonna keep let me keep tinkering away at this, and I'm gonna take a look and see. I got some mods to download. I usually keep a good database of mods downloaded, so I need to take a look at that. And actually, I'm gonna make me some more coffee. So yeah, and I'll keep looking at this for you and see what I can come up with. So I hope that helps. And yeah, I'll be here. So just holler at me anytime.